Okay, what's up everybody? Pastor Matt here. This is video number 2 or episode 2 on my search for the best Greek New Testament series. I'm going to do several of these videos as I'm considering which Greek New Testament to use in 2021 as I have decided to read through the Greek New Testament. Something I've never actually done before. I mentioned in the previous video that I've studied books in the Greek. I've translated some, but I've never read through the entire Greek New Testament, and I want to do that this year. So in this second video, we're going to consider the Greek New Testament produced by the Tyndale House in cooperation with Cambridge and Crossway. It's kind of a cross-promotional project between Cambridge and Crossway with a new edition of the Greek New Testament. Came out just a couple of years ago, and we're going to review it here in this video. I do want to mention that this is the hardback edition. It does come in some other covers, a True Tone cover, and then there's a reader's edition, which we're going to review separately, as well as some scripture journals in the Greek, which again, we're also going to review those separately in a different video. So this is the hardback edition. It's hand size. It's about the same size as the Nestle Aland 28, which we reviewed in the previous video. And this one does come with a nice hard shell box if you're interested in these things. Usually whenever I have these boxes, I just kind of put them aside and don't really use them so much. And then there's an entire little paperback book, about 100 pages or so, by Dirk Jonkind, and we'll look at this in a little bit too. And this explains their methodology for the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, because it is different from either the Textus Receptus Greek Testaments and from the Nestle Aland or the UBS editions. This is a different Greek New Testament, so let's go ahead and get into it. This is the basic hardback. It comes with a nice vinyl inside sheet here. The liner is pretty nice. It's not paper. It's not going to break right away. We open it up. We've got the editor, Dirk Jonkind, along with Peter J. Williams, and their assistant editors. This is the Crossway edition and not the Cambridge edition. One of the first things you're going to notice right here is that the books of the Bible, or the New Testament, are actually in a different order than your New Testament and your regular Bible if you have a King James or an ESV or a New King James. That's right, they have them kind of in a different order here. You've got basically the general epistles coming before the Pauline epistles, but with the Gospels and, of course, Revelation towards the end. So basically the big flipperoo here is in putting the general epistles like James and the Petrine letters. Those are going to come before Paul's epistles. And apparently that reflects some scholarly or some scribal habits, I should say, in the earlier centuries. And that right there is going to be a very good clue into what makes this Greek New Testament unusual and different from the other critical texts. Now, I should say this is a critical text. This is an eclectic text that's going to draw on the resources and insights from many other manuscripts, ancient manuscripts, in fact, of the Greek New Testament. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But let's go ahead and just look at an average page on the inside. This is Matthew chapter 9. I read this one for my devotions this morning. Again, you'll notice the pen marks. Those are words that I didn't know, and so I glossed them in with a little Pigma Micron pen here. One of the biggest differences between this and the Nestle Aland, as you can clearly see here, is that the apparatus is much smaller in the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. Now, that's not to say this isn't a scholarly or technical edition. It certainly is that, but at least in this edition right here, and there are others, this one preferences a easy, clean reading edition. And so it very much de-emphasizes the apparatus at the bottom, although the apparatus in this edition works very much like the Nestle Aland 28, which we've already looked at, and the ways that it cues you to which manuscripts have readings and which manuscripts have variant readings. But it basically reduces it to the very most important information. Other than that, you just have the Greek text. And you'll notice that there are bold verses here and that the paragraphs are differentiated by these sort of hanging chads out here, as I like to call them. These hanging verse numbers indicate new paragraphs. But one of my criticisms about this edition here for reading is that it doesn't contain any subject heading sections or no section demarcators. So sometimes I like just a little bit of help in the English. You look at the Greek text and you're like, okay, well, what story is this? Is this a miracle? Is this a healing story? And like many editions of the Greek New Testament, they sometimes give you some of those clues that just give you a little bit of a mental break when you're about to read a section. But here there's almost nothing in English. And so I find that to be like, I open this up and it's just a great wall of Greek. And I find that to be a little bit intimidating when I turn to any page and begin to try to work through it. No helpers very much in the English. There are no cross references. You basically have just a rather bald edition of the Greek New Testament. You do have verse numbers, thankfully, and you do have paragraph divisions, but not a lot of helpers when it comes to that additional material in the pages themselves. Okay, so very slight apparatus. The font is good. The letters are very clear. It's a good Greek reading font. Nice bold verse markers are easily identifiable. I should say, too, that this edition has some of the best paper of any Greek New Testament that I've seen. This is real book paper. Nice, beautiful, clean, smooth, sleek paper. Very thick. The writing will not bleed through no matter what kind of pen you use for the most part. Now, I'm sure there's some pens that are so sloppy they'll bleed through no matter what. But this is going to be one of your better editions in terms of writing on it. So let's jump to the end. And actually the introduction to this Greek New Testament is at the end of this book rather than at the beginning. So what makes this different from the Nestle Aland? That's a very important question. Well, this too is a critical and eclectic text, meaning that it combines the insight from many, many, many manuscripts. Of course, there are over 5,500 manuscripts, ancient and otherwise, of the Greek New Testament. But what really sets this apart, and this is the most important thing I'm going to say about this review, is that the Tyndale House Greek New Testament highly, highly, highly preferences the most ancient manuscript authorities. In fact, one of the things that they say here in the introduction is that if you can't prove that text reading in the first 500 years of the Greek New Testament manuscripts, then it's not going to be highly considered at all for this Greek New Testament text. And so that means that there's going to be a great preference to those older Alexandrian manuscripts rather than the Byzantine later manuscripts that we sometimes call the majority text. Now, in some ways, this is a majority text, but wait, it's a majority text for the manuscripts that have the most antiquity. Okay, so we're not going by sheer numerical majority as in the Byzantine text, which the Textus Receptus is of course built upon, but we're going with the majority of the most ancient texts. And so this is, as it says in the introduction here, a revision of the Trigellus edition, Samuel Trigellus, 1813 to 1875. And so basically they started with the Trigellus edition, which precedes the Westcott and Hort edition. So basically they cut those guys out of the mix, started back with the Trigellus edition, and they began focusing, editing, and essentially reworking Trigellus's older work with a very high preference to the most ancient manuscripts. And I have to admit, I really think that's a pretty cool way to do it. That's what makes this different from the Nestle Aland. Now, of course, the Nestle Aland and the UBS text, those are the same as each other for the most part. They're going to incorporate all kinds of data, the most amount of data of any of the Greek New Testaments. But the Tyndale House Greek New Testament basically works on this premise. Again, if you can't prove it, that it's in the first 500 years of New Testament manuscript transmission, then it's not going to make it into this edition. So this makes this special and unique. So here's the paragraph that I wanted to read for you. This is the salient information. In keeping with the Trigellus documentary approach, we've sought to reduce the likelihood that any reading adopted is a mere scribal aberration by insisting that our text be attested in 2 or more Greek manuscripts, at least one being from the 5th century or earlier. And then they do say that we've relaxed this rule somewhat for the book of Revelation owing to its more limited range of extensive witnesses. So in other words, it's just hard to find some very ancient copies of Revelation. Not that it's not ancient in and of itself, but as far as the papyri go and the majuscule text, we just don't have quite as many resources with the book of Revelation as we do with, for instance, the Gospels or the general epistles or the Pauline epistles. So I like that. That makes this totally unique. This makes this a preference text for the oldest manuscripts. And you have to have, according to their rule, at least one manuscript that has that particular reading in the first 500 years of the church, confirmed by another. That confirmation text can be outside of the first 500 years, but nothing will make it into this text that does not have manuscript representation in the first 500 years. So what does that mean? Well, that means like a text like the John's comma in 1 John chapter 5 verse 7 is not going to make it into this text because there is no Greek manuscript until like the 15th century that has that reading. So there's no way that's going to make it into this text. This is going to be the best representation of the first 500 years of New Testament manuscript transmission. Now, some people will say, but wait a second, the Textus Receptus is the Bible that's been used for the last 400 years. I mean, that's the text of the Reformation and Erasmus and Beza. That's the text that underlies the Geneva Bible and the King James and many of the great translations in the Reformation era. But this Bible is not trying to answer the question of what has been used in the last 400, 500 years. This Greek New Testament is trying to answer a different question. What is the text that they had in the first 400 or 500 years of the early church and New Testament manuscript tradition? That's what makes this different. Okay, so whereas the Textus Receptus basically only worked from 12 to 15 manuscripts, at least in Erasmus's time, a little bit more than that as Beza comes into the scene and Stephanus as well. But nevertheless, their manuscripts that they had in the Reformation era were limited, and that's basically the product of incomplete archaeology and manuscript discovery process. But today, we have over 5,500 manuscripts, and yet this text does not seek to use as a heavy reliance those later manuscripts of 1000 AD, 1200 AD. Those are not considered as highly as the earliest New Testament manuscripts. Now, there's a lot more to be said about their process here for this particular book, and if you find that interesting, then that's where this comes in. This book right here explains their entire methodology for how they did, what they did, why they chose what they chose. And so I just want to read you the outline here. I did read this entire book, and I found it very interesting. The chapter headings are Your Greek New Testament in the Manuscripts, Practicalities, Manuscripts, How Decisions Are Made, so that's how they decided which reading to include. And then they have a chapter on why not the Textus Receptus and why not the Byzantine text. I thought those were the two most interesting chapters. Then they have a theology of transmission of the text and another little section here, where do we go from here? This book is an easy read, and it'll definitely help you to understand why they did what they did. And so I think this is a great addition here because it brings something to the table that neither the Textus Receptus nor the Nestle Aland bring to the table, and that is a very, very strong preference, in fact, almost exclusionary to the point of using only the manuscripts from the first 500 years. So a heavy reliance upon the papyri and a heavy reliance upon the great majuscule Greek texts. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a link in the description of this video to Amazon if you want to go over there and grab this one for yourself. Now, I haven't decided whether or not this is going to be the one that I'm going to read through for 2021. I still have some other Greek New Testaments to review. But one thing I have decided is that I'm probably going to have to do a pretty big video about the difference between critical texts and the Textus Receptus. I find that as much information as there is about there in that debate, much of it is still pretty mired in ad hominem argumentation and fruit of the poison tree fallacies and things like that. So I'm going to probably do a video where I evaluate the difference between the TR and the critical text, and I'm going to give strengths and weaknesses for both, because there really is strengths and weaknesses for both of those positions. And I think reasonably we can talk about these things without calling each other demon possessed and all kinds of crazy things that fly around when you start talking about the importance of the Greek manuscripts. There's certainly a lot of insulting happening, which is a shame, of course, because as Christians we should be reasonable debaters, and so I'm going to be able to provide a video for that, I hope. All right, so I've kind of wandered though from this review here in the last few moments. Again, link in the description to grab this one online on Amazon. Thanks for so much for checking into this video. Do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.